We Can Find a Way. İdil presents.
The maiden voyage of We Can Find a Way features Bill Marsh, whom I interviewed in the days of the coronavirus. Hello and welcome to We Can Find a Way, a podcast about conflict resolution. My name is İdil. This podcast has been around for over a year by its Turkish name, which translates almost to We Can Find a Way. When I started it, my goal was limited to reaching the Turkish-speaking world. The lockdown, triggered by the coronavirus, created the opportunity to reflect. I decided to pursue a new goal now, which is to reach a wider audience by making the podcast bilingual. This means that from now on, some content will be in Turkish only, some will have a voiceover in Turkish, some will be available only in English. My first guest in We Can Find a Way is Bill Marsh, who has mediated full-time since 1991 in a wide range of commercial, religious, environmental, ethnic and political disputes and conflicts involving governments, national and international businesses, professional firms, factions, pressure groups and individuals from over 50 countries. He has been independently ranked every year as one of Europe's top commercial mediators. He served as an advisor on mediation and conflict resolution to many governments like Russia, Ukraine, Turkey, Romania, Bulgaria, Slovakia, as well as public institutions like the UN, EU Commission, and the World Bank. Bill trains and mentors mediators from around the world. He is on the advisory board of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Conflict Issues in the UK Parliament and is a distinguished fellow of the International Academy of Mediators. He is also the co-editor of the Kluwer Mediation blog. I'm fortunate enough to have observed them mediating a couple of times, and I've been wanting this interview ever since. We were supposed to meet in person in London back in March 2020, but for obvious reasons, we ended up conducting this interview over Skype on 3rd April 2020. I'm grateful to Bill for being the first guest of We Can Find a Way as it begins maiden voyage. The first question is, how do you prepare for a standard mediation? How much time do you need?
Yeah, I think the question about preparation is an important one. It's partly the mediator who needs to be prepared in the sense of understanding the case, and it's partly about preparing the others who will take part, the parties, the advisors and so on. Because really the mediator's job is to enable people to get the most out of the process. And so where you've got people who are not used to the process, it's important to think about how you best prepare them as well. So for myself, I like to read the papers about the case. I ask parties to send me a summary of the key issues and any important papers that go with it, maybe the contract or the court papers or whatever it is. So there's a certain amount of preparation that is just about me understanding their case, what the key issues are. The second thing I then do is talk to them, talk to the lawyers, talk to the parties if they're available as well, before the mediation and say, look, we have this opportunity of a mediation. How can we best use it? What are the important issues to talk about? How do you want to approach the mediation? What concerns do you have? And so on. So together we're trying to work out what is going to be the most constructive and effective use of the time.
How long do you need for all of these activities?
Typically, I would want somewhere between half a day and a day, including phone calls with the parties and their advisors and so on.
Do you put a length limit for the papers that they submit?
Well, we put a length request. Certainly, the request is for the case summary to be usually a maximum of about 10 pages, and then for any accompanying papers. But in a complicated case, the papers can be extremely lengthy. I have whole boxes arriving at the office, papers that people want me to read to understand it. I think it's important to understand it, not to get lost in the detail, but to understand the details so that you can step back from it and ask the broader questions, which is a lot of what the mediator's role is.
Do the conversations that you're having change depending on the experience of the parties with mediation?
Yes, they can change a lot. So with parties who are not experienced in mediation at all, I would want to have a discussion with them about what the process involves, how we can structure the process so that it works as well as possible, what concerns they have, how they're going to make the best use of the opportunity. So, for example, in meetings between the parties where I'm present, who's going to do the talking? Is it the lawyers who will do the talking? Will their clients talk? And if so, how can they contribute effectively? And so on. So a lot of it is about making people comfortable with what to expect, because generally speaking, where people are comfortable, they contribute more effectively. Then if there are parties who are very experienced in mediation, they'll have their own views as well as I will on things they want to do and the way they want to play it. And it may be that one party has a very different view of how they want the mediation to run from the other party, in which case there's a whole series of discussions to be had about the best way to structure the process which they can agree on. And a good example of that would be joint meetings. Some parties are very reluctant to meet jointly, others are very enthusiastic to meet jointly, and so a way forward has to be found.
I was observing you mediating with the consent of the parties. It caught my attention that after the parties made their legal points, you clearly steered them away from legal matters into negotiation. I remember noting your exact words, we're here, something to that effect. In mediation, I understand, the enthusiasm to bring across the legal matters, but we're here to also negotiate, something to that effect. Maybe you can tell me.
Yeah, look,
why was that intervention necessary?
Again, it comes back to getting value out of the mediation process. There are different conversations in mediation which have to take place. There is a conversation about the law, which is often important, and I want to make space for that.
Right.
Because the issues that divide the parties may well be legal issues. So they need a proper airing, they need to be discussed and so on. Having said that, if that's all we do in the mediation, just exchange views on the law, then it's probably a waste of time. So it's a balance to be achieved between giving people enough opportunity to state and discuss the way they see it legally and the way they see it commercially or personally or in any other way, but also moving on from saying, I understand you have different views on this, whether they're different views about the law or the business or whatever. So at some point, we need to move on from that discussion to a discussion about how to resolve it.
It's basically steering them towards more cooperative, in fact, balancing actions rather than just getting stuck in the law, as you have said.
Yes, that's exactly right. It's about making sure that all the important discussions which need to take place do take place. And one of those is about the law, but it's only one.
And this is not a court. We're not deciding
Exactly.
things, or you're not deciding things according to the law, right? So
Exactly. But equally, if you were to say to parties that the legal issues are not relevant, they would be very surprised. And I think they would find that not appropriate in a mediation because there are legal issues. So it's just a question of making sure that the time and the focus are divided properly between legal issues, business issues, finding a way forward, and so on.
So when is the time to make that intervention? You said you have to allow them some airing, but when do you feel it becomes more relevant or more necessary?
I think you can often tell in a mediation when the discussion is essentially finished.
Right.
Usually because it's going round and round in circles.
Yeah.
And so that's the point at which to say, look, I think we've done enough on that topic. We need to move on. And I think it's important as well to be clear with parties that the purpose of them discussing, let's say the legal issues, is not so that one of them can beat the other one into submission.
Right.
But it's so that they are clear as possible about what the other parties say, so they can make some good decisions about it. If you set the focus as clarity rather than agreement, then you're much more likely to make progress.
Speaking of decision making, actually, lawyers may sometimes be not very creative. And you also mentioned now that sometimes, even in mediation, the parties turn round and round on legal matters. So, can you please explain how this, in creativity, affects the mediation process?
It's not really a comment about lawyers particularly so much as a comment about all of humankind.
Sorry.
No, that's fine. But, whenever we're in a dispute, we tend, all of us, to get locked into a particular way of seeing it.
Or a position.
Or a position, exactly. And so part of one's role as a mediator is to try and enable people to see things differently. Creativity can be an important part of that. Creativity doesn't just apply to the outcomes or the solutions, it can also apply to the process. So there's some important thinking to do about who could meet with whom in a mediation as a more creative process. And often, actually, I'll find myself bringing the decision makers together at various stages in a mediation because they're the ones ultimately with ownership. So that there are questions around the creativity of process. There are also questions around the creativity of substance, because if we look at a problem exclusively through a legal lens, then we will exacerbate the differences between the parties because it's probably or often the legal issues they disagree about. So I think enabling people to look creatively at the problem means to look more broadly at it. And then finally, it's about looking creatively at solutions as well. In other words, are there ways of sorting this problem that are let's say, wider or broader than the kind of outcomes which a court could order?
We are doing this interview in the days of coronavirus. It is almost a requirement for a lot of people to get experience through observations. But we know that this experience is transforming face-to-face mediation. A lot of mediations are being conducted via Zoom. How do you think this will affect the business? How do you think this will affect observations that are being made by novices? Yeah, let's jump right in.
You're quite right. These are very strange, rather surreal days that we're in. Yeah, I think mediation has already found its feet in this new world. I'm certainly mediating online a fair amount. All honesty, I don't think it's as enjoyable for a mediator as the face-to-face personal contact, but that's just my personal view. But it can be perfectly effective, perfectly functional, and so it's important, to maximize the opportunities and to give people the chance to have proper dialogue, even when we're all isolated from each other. So I think it will undoubtedly grow. I haven't had any observers with me on online mediations. I haven't really thought through what the challenges of that will be. But as you know from your own experience, I do take observers with me on cases, and I enjoy that, and hopefully they enjoy it as well.
Do you think there will still be face-to-face mediations going on rather than online?
So, well, not at the moment, but I'm quite certain once this is over, we'll get back to that. I'm quite certain we will, because there are things you can do particularly in very difficult mediations that you can do better face-to-face. Just that degree of human contact is very important. But I'm sure also there'll be people who, having tried it, say that they don't want to bother with the travel involved in a mediation, and they would rather attend on an online platform instead. So these are things we're going to have to address. I mean, the irony of it is, of course, that when mediation came in, certainly in this country and all the countries I've been involved in, one of the claims mediation has always made is to be a very flexible process. And it makes that claim in the face of court processes, which tend to be less flexible. So if mediation is genuinely a flexible process, as it is, then it needs to show that it can respond to the challenges of social distancing by going online, and has shown that very well so far.
Right. So mediation has always claimed that it was also cost effective. And what you're saying, if this becomes the new norm, if you will, then, all these hotel and air travel costs will also be saved, which will be, again, playing into the hands of mediation, I guess.
Well, I think that's right. A colleague of mine did a mediation last week by Zoom. There were 4 parties, and they calculated that between those 4 parties and their various advisors, The travel time they had saved, not the cost, but the time, amounted to 60 hours, 60 hours, just for one mediation, for people coming from all over the country to get there. So you can quite see that the efficiencies are very, very significant, and that may drive people in that direction. I don't think it will ever take over exclusively. I think there will always be people who want to meet in person as well, but I can quite see it growing in popularity.
Do you think this is a generational issue as well? Because online dispute resolution has been long predicted to be like the promised land almost, but it wasn't really like taking over. Now, all of a sudden, it has become the norm. Maybe some people are taking more advantage of that, while some aren't. There will always be some face-to-face. And for those who are comfortable with it, now the argument is kind of like won.
Well, I think that's absolutely right, İdil. And I think of my son's generation. I have 3 sons. They're all in their 20s. For them, it's absolutely normal to meet with people via Skype or Zoom or some of the other platforms. And they are in regular contact, daily contact probably, with people all over the world on those kind of platforms. So it's completely normal for them and for their generation. And I think they will find it much easier to shift into this way. And the same actually for the new generation of lawyers. One of my sons is a lawyer. So they're shifting to online hearings where you don't turn up at the court, you simply attend via platform. He finds that completely normal.
Right.
Whereas my generation of his colleagues are much less instinctively comfortable with it.
You're a very busy mediator, yet you're the editor of the Clover Mediation blog. What made you pioneer this idea, and what do you think will be the new platforms, especially after the advent of online mediation in the future?
Well, yeah, thank you. I mean, I think the Clover Mediation blog is a great initiative. I have to say it wasn't my idea in the first place. I wish it was. Okay. But I am the editor of it. You're quite right, or the co-editor, in fact. So it's, I think, like any professional field, mediation benefits from exchanges of views, exchanges of practice, and so on. And one way of achieving this is for people to write blogs. So we have a whole series of regular bloggers, and we like guest bloggers as well. People talking about something that is happening in mediation in their part of the world, or that is a particular challenge, and so on. We are having a recent series on COVID-19 and the impact on mediation. Right. We had a long series on the Singapore Mediation Convention.
Which is the next question.
Okay, on enforceability. And, I think it's really important for us as a global community of mediators to talk through these issues. One of the things I love seeing is the way in which colleagues in Brazil or the US or South Africa or Singapore, Australia, parts of Europe are dealing with these issues differently and the different perspectives that people have. So the blog is very much about sharing learning, promoting ideas and challenging the way we all think. I think the danger with any profession and any idea is to think that you've arrived, because then we all stop being creative and developing things. The blog is really a forum for people who want to extend their thinking and exchange ideas and practices and so on for the good of us all.
There's no finality in human affairs.
That's a very good way of putting it. And there's certainly no finality in the process of resolving conflict.
What do you predict will be the most difficult issue in terms of enforceability of mediation agreements under the Singapore Convention?
So the Singapore Convention is a really welcome development. I think it gives a certain credibility, a certain international credibility to the mediation process. It answers the concerns, certainly that some people have had, that the outcomes they reach in mediation might not be enforceable. It's too early to tell how it's going to work in practice. I think if I had one concern, it's this. If you think about the convention, it will only ever be relied on by parties where they are contesting the enforceability of an agreement. So you have to assume that one party wants to get out of an agreement it's reached and the other party wants to force them to stick to it. So if one party wants to get out, they will look for reasons to get out. There are opportunities, potentially or theoretically at least, within the terms of the convention to say that they were unduly influenced by the mediator. I think in practice, the terms of the convention deal with that pretty well. So I don't think it will be a major problem. But in circumstances where one party is motivated to make allegations about something a mediator did, and no one else is there to give evidence about how accurate those are, there is the possibility of some abuse. The overwhelming majority of challenges, if there are challenges under the convention, will not be a problem.
You're actually bringing forward the argument for mediation ethics or mediator ethics. If I understand you correctly, there will be less factual or legal issues, rather the actions of the mediator will be more called upon in order to get rid of the enforceability of a mediation agreement. That's the idea I'm getting. And I guess in places where mediation has been conducted, where ethics isn't as strong, then this might prevent the enforceability of mediation agreements that are entered in those jurisdictions, right?
Yes, theoretically, that's all possible. Whether it turns out to be the case is a completely different question. I think one of the interesting things this brings up is what is acceptable from a mediator in different cultures. Some cultures, for example, would find challenging questions less acceptable than other cultures. There is a degree of pressure which a mediator can bring to bear in some cultures, which is acceptable, whereas in other cultures, people would say, no, that's just not an acceptable way for a mediator to behave. The convention obviously deals only with international mediations. And so one can see possibly that a mediator from one country dealing with parties from other countries might find that the way they conducted themselves, even if it's completely acceptable in their own country, was not so well received by people from another country. And I think the overlap between cultural behaviour and ethics is quite an interesting one in those areas.
I'm immediately thinking of an example where, bringing gifts is to parties or to the mediator, and I'm not talking about a Rolex watch, obviously, is completely acceptable or even cherished.
That's an excellent example. It would be something that was done entirely in good faith by one party, which was received entirely badly by another party simply because of the context in which they live and operate.
Okay, Bill, thank you so much for allocating time from our busy schedules in home.
It's a great pleasure.
This concludes the maiden voyage of We Can Find a Way. Just to recap the most important points made by Bill Marsh, he talked about preparation. We heard that, depending on the complexity of a case, he spends at least half a day for that. He also emphasized that depending on the party's experience with mediation, he took different steps in preparing them. We also discuss how to create value in mediation by the airing of legal issues, but not allowing these issues to be the dominating ones among others. After we finished the interview, I remembered that Bill took breaks between meetings with the parties, whether they were caucuses or joint meetings. I sent him an email asking the reason for that, and here is his answer that I would like to share with you. Quote, "Because I want to digest what I have heard. Think about its impact on the negotiations. Think about how to move the process forward. If we just bounce from room to room without pausing, then we lose the opportunity to stand back and reflect. If we lose that, we can get very caught up in the parties' perspectives and emotions, and that can diminish the value we can add." End of quote. Bill and I also discussed the advent of online mediation and the savings this contributed to in terms of time and money. Nevertheless, Bill emphasized that there would always be a place for face-to-face mediation. Finally, we discussed the Singapore Convention, especially in terms of contesting the enforceability of a mediation agreement. I hope you enjoyed this program. Please do let me know your views at ielveris@icloud.com. I'm grateful to Alper Koç, who's the sponsor of We Can Find a Way, and Can Aksoy, who helps me in marketing. Thank you and see you in the next program.
We Can Find a Way. İdil presented.